Good morning. My name is Robin DiPietro, and I'm a program coordinator for OneOp. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session, Decoding Challenges, Understanding Adversity, Trauma, and Developmental Delay. In case you're joining us for the first time, I'd like to give you a brief tour of our webinar platform so you can find your way around. Hopefully, you're currently able to view the slides we're sharing. If you're unable to see them or if you have any other difficulties, please email us at contact@oneop.org, and I will place that into the chat here for you. As some of you have already done, we look forward to having you join us in the chat pod for conversation and questions. To embed the chat pod so you don't miss any links or conversation, simply place your cursor over the shared slides. You'll then see a toolbar pop up across the bottom of your screen, and from there, just click the chat bubble icon. When typing questions or comments, please be sure to select everyone from the response options drop-down menu so that everyone's able to view them in the chat pod. Note that the slides and resources are available for download on the event page for today's session. We will be covering continuing education information at the end of the webinar, so please stay tuned if you're interested in continuing education or a certificate of attendance. For those of you who didn't get a chance to see the link for the event page and to access those resources, there it is for you in the chat now. Thank you for joining us as we continue our partnership with the Department of Defense and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to expand the readiness, knowledge, and networks of the professionals supporting our military service members and their families. The views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the official policy of the Defense Department, U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. government, or OneUp. The mention of any entity or product is for informational purposes only. Today, we're joined by Dr. Carlo Panlilio. He is an associate professor of educational psychology and a faculty member with the Social Science Research Institute's Child Maltreatment Solutions Network at the Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Panlilio previously worked as a family therapist in private practice, community agencies, treatment foster care, and a residential treatment facility for adolescents. Before I turn things over to Dr. Panlilio, you may want to, again, make sure you have a copy of the slides at the bottom of the webinar event page under Event Materials. I'll put a link again in the chat to that in just a moment. And at this point, I'm going to mute my microphone and turn things over to Dr. Panlilio.
Thanks so much, Robin. Hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to our webinar for today. Today I will be talking about understanding the differences and maybe overlap between adversity and trauma, which are two terms that oftentimes we find ourselves hearing as we're talking about trauma-informed practices and the impact of trauma or adversity on children's learning and development. In that vein, we'll also talk about what the impact of early childhood adversity and trauma might be on development and learning, and what you can do as the caring adults, teachers, educators, and support for these kids who've experienced adversity. We're going to also cover some age-related learning processes as well as the outcomes for kids and families in the context of adversity and trauma. And as well as understand how perhaps children don't necessarily follow a singular path in their development, which means that for kids who have experienced adversity and trauma, oftentimes the way they grow and develop will differ based on what else is around in their context. And finally, we'll be able to talk about and be able to identify some of the trauma-informed educational strategies that you might be able to employ to help promote learning and development for children who've experienced adversity and trauma. In particular, understanding how we can bring some of these about early on in their infancy, toddlerhood, and in early elementary, so that we can maybe prevent some long-term downstream consequences of adversity. At any point in time, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. If I could answer them right away, I will, but also know that I will take some pauses in between so that I can look at some of the questions that Robin will present and be able to hopefully answer some of those for you. All right, so let's begin by looking at how we define trauma and adversity. And so, for everyone here in the chat pod, I want you to think about this question. In what ways do you think the definitions of trauma and adversity might differ from one another? Um, Please feel free to select everyone in the drop-down menu and begin writing down some of your ideas. This is not about being right or wrong. It's really helpful for me to understand your own thoughts around this. And I'll give you about a minute to think through this and um, put this down in the chat. Excellent. Thank you so much for putting in some of your definitions. If you're still in the process of doing so, please feel free to add to the definitions that's on the chat. These are great. It's helpful to see where everyone starts with in terms of their definition of trauma and adversity. So when we begin to look at these two terms, which for trauma, for example, drawn from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, trauma is defined as a frightening, dangerous, or violent event that poses a threat to a child's life or bodily integrity. These can oftentimes initiate strong emotions and physical reactions that persist long after the event. Whereas adversity, especially in childhood, is defined as this exposure during early childhood through adolescence, so across the lifespan, to environmental circumstances that are likely to require significant psychological, social, or neurobiological adaptation by an average child. And this represents a deviation from the expectable environment. And what that means is if we have an environment in which we expect, for example, safety or um, um, some sort of routine that if it changes, then a child has to then adapt to some of those environmental circumstances. And so when we are thinking about these two, and I've seen some of this in the chat, that some, but not all adverse childhood experiences necessarily have the capacity to cause trauma. Um, and what that means is that oftentimes when we begin to think of adversity, it to some degree may even have some sort of positive adaptive response. And oftentimes when we think of adversity, it's a challenge that oftentimes we overcome or try to overcome. And we'll talk about this in the context of being in a very supportive environment. Um, what happens, however, and I've seen some of you note this in the chat, is that some adverse events can potentially become traumatic. And trauma, in this sense, is really a very clinical term in which a lot of the symptoms begin to show up that is related to post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, especially in childhood. And so when we begin to think about these adverse events resulting into then later trauma or trauma symptoms, kids who have been exposed to one or more of these traumatic events over their lifetime may then begin to suffer traumatic stress that oftentimes persist and be able to and affect their lives even after the conclusion of that adverse event. And what we especially is relevant to us today is the impact on the academic domain when we see how kids who have experienced adversity that develops into trauma um, begin to suffer academically in their grades, in their social, emotional interactions with peers and teachers. So according to the NCTSN, when we look at some of the types of adverse and traumatic events, these are, again, not necessarily exhaustive, and not necessarily traumatic per se, but without the supportive environments, without some of the um, care and support from adults like teachers and educators, may then turn into trauma. So a lot of these are not, again, as I mentioned, exhaustive. It's also not necessarily mutually exclusive. And so when you begin to think about some of these traumatic events, like, for example, early childhood trauma. These are potentially adverse events that occur early in childhood, like, let's say, a natural disaster that may persist without that supportive relationship. Complex trauma, which also happens early in childhood, typically involves close caregivers for children, where a lot of the uh, um, experiences that may include, for example, sexual abuse or physical abuse or neglect, um, may then evolve into long-term developmental consequences for children. Now, as you can see across all of these different types, the impact may be perceived to be very different from event to event and for child to child. And when we think about some of these, like terrorism and violence, when we begin to think about school shootings, it's a very different traumatic event from, let's say, natural disasters. So for both of these, it occurs at a broader scale in the schools, but the cause and the events are quite different. Um, then you can also differentiate that from events that are a little bit more interpersonal in this matter, like bullying or abuse and neglect, which are directed more towards the singular or focal child. And so it's important for us to understand that even though these are all considered to be traumatic events or adverse events, that the impact and the source may be varied. Which leads us to then talk about what happens as kids begin to experience some of these adverse events and its effect on their development over time. Um, when we think about the childhood impact of adversity, and as you uh, know back or recall, oops, sorry, as you recall back to the different types of events, as I mentioned, there are some that are more broad towards the school community or the classroom, like natural disasters, and those that are more internal to the child. It's important for us to think about where specifically in the microsystem of the child this might be impacted. And so one way to begin to think about children's development and learning is to really understand this sort of bioecological model where we see this individual child. And as even though it is an individual child noted here, understand that each child will have their own ecosystem like this. Each adult will have their own ecosystem like this that then interact with one another to form some of the more microsystems in which we begin to, as individuals, interact with one another to become dyads, to become peers, and to become groups. And so when we begin to think about the individual child that we come into contact with in our classroom, most of their development and learning is primarily influenced by the relationship with their caregiver at home, but also shaped by different environments and interactions across multiple levels, which means, for example, as educators within the school microsystem, as you see here, that will have an influence in terms of how you and I interact with the children to promote some of those developmental and learning processes. Um, how we interact with our students and our children in the classroom, as well as how parents and caregivers interact with um, children, is influenced by different levels across here. And so when we think about, for example, the mesosystem in which we have the school microsystem and the home microsystem interact, that's important in terms of its impact on children's learning and development. So think about family engagement processes and how as educators, reaching out to family members is then a way to connect school and home to create this mesosystem that will be more supportive, hopefully for children's development and learning. Look at the broader ecosystem as well. When you look at the macro system, the economic system, for example, that may have an impact um, on how parents could provide resources to their children and how, for example, school funding models may impact how teachers and educators and school systems can provide specific resources to the students. Um, and so there's a lot of these interactive processes that occur across different levels. And this is particularly important during the early childhood period, because when we think about early childhood, it's a sensitive period of development. Children are born with tons of neurons that are ready to connect. And so having that experience in which they are exposed to this rich environment, um, uh, also known as experience-driven developmental plasticity, right, allows children to actually be more receptive to some of those connections in their response to the environment. For example, growing up in a home with access to parents who are constantly reading to children, to infants, will expose them to a higher language exposure or higher meaning language utterances that would promote language development for children. In the same way that as early care, early care, sorry, early care and education providers, or ECE professionals and educators, being able to expose young children, infants and toddlers in these classrooms could help promote some of this neural connections that actually help uh, children become school ready. And so these daily living, social skills, and cognitive development really depends on the positive and responsive caregiving in the lives of kids, not just in the home, but also in schools and daycare providers. Uh, and so, because this is such an important period of development for kids, in which um, having this brain that is malleable or plastic and ready to receive environmental input for the child to adapt, hopefully in a more responsive, positive way in the environment, uh, the flip side could occur in which experiencing adversity during this period, when there is a highly malleable brain, can then exhibit some negative impact in children's physical, cognitive, and social emotional development. So, for example, in that scenario where infants are exposed to the home or uh, caregiving environment in which there is rich language input, the opposite in which kids grow up in homes where there is minimal conversations that occur. There aren't the presence of books in which we read to the infants and toddlers. What we'll see then is a decline in cognitive and linguistic domains of development that then will result in negative cascades as children develop over time. And with that, as kids experience many of those traumatic and adverse events early in childhood, what we then notice is that absence of many of these important developmental milestones or input from the environment. What we then begin to see is that kids who experience trauma, and looking at this sort of prevalence rate, um, 25% of children will experience at least one traumatic event by age 16. And so for a lot of these children, experiencing adverse events and traumatic events earlier on in their lifetime, especially in the sensitive period of development, are at greater risk of developing developmental delays, particularly around physical and social, emotional, and mental health problems that cross the lifespan. And when you look at this number, kids who experience at least one early childhood adversity are more likely to actually develop or experience a developmental delay relative to kids who have not experienced prior adversity. And that's only one adverse event. And imagine for kids, as I mentioned earlier, there is an accumulation of a cumulative effect of adversity, in that when we see kids who actually experience three or more adverse events, we see this likelihood increase to 1.9 times that of children who have not experienced prior adversity. And so that in itself is really um, concerning when we begin to think about the impact of adversity on children's development and the development of, or sorry, the onset of developmental delay. Uh, Alternatively, when we begin to look at the impact of or the effect of developmental delay or developmental disability on the likelihood of children actually experiencing trauma and adversity, we see that kids who have experienced um, maltreatment, for example, like abuse, also then have a reported disability as they get older compared to 5% of the school age children. And as I mentioned earlier, with the absence of some of these important environmental input like language, reading, and social emotional interactions with their parents, caregivers, and other adults in the family, we see that there's an increase in impaired language. We see an increase in problems with behavior as well as social skills functioning, which, as we begin to think about this for kids entering school, as they transition from early care and education into K through 12, how many of these behaviors and delays and later disability may impact children's learning. Um, Additionally, what happens for kids, especially children who have already, let's say, with the risk factor of developmental delay early on, or those children who have delays that turn into disabilities, what we begin to see is that the risk of experiencing adverse events or traumatic events like abuse and neglect actually increases. And one way to think about that is for these kids who already have a delay with, let's say, language, not being able to communicate may elicit or evoke um, a strong emotional reaction on the adults, and not being able to understand can then have this sort of bidirectional effect on increase in some of these adverse experiences. So, um, why is that important when we begin to think about the impact of adversity on children's development and learning? For one, when we begin to think about adversity and trauma, we can begin to think about the impact on our stress response system. And so this picture on the right is an example of our stress response system, where we begin to see, for example, that as you um, uh, go through the environment, go through your day-to-day experiences, you come across something that is stress-inducing. For example, if some of you haven't noticed yet, there is a big spider crawling on the corner of the screen. And so something like this that just pops up may elicit a stress response in which our adrenal cortex releases cortisol into our brain, which then prepares us to act. And so some of us, hopefully you haven't sort of swatted that spider on your screen, and hopefully no one's screen is broken. Um, but this is where we have, for example, an experience of positive stress. If we think about this taxonomy on the left, these are brief increases in heart rate, right? Mild elevations in stress hormone levels. When we see something that is stressful, the cortisol gets injected in our body. It prepares us to fight, to flee, or to freeze. And once we figure out, oh, it's not really threatening, then we go back to baseline. For some, and this is where it's important to understand individual differences in how we react. Some people might see that spider and think, oh, you know what? It's nothing. It's part of the presentation. I'll think about something else. I'll ignore it. For some who might think it's an actual spider, they may get uh, scared at first, but then realize that it's not real, and then again go back to baseline. For some who may actually, and I apologize if there are people who are afraid of spiders, who may actually have agoraphobia, it's now hard to disengage our attention from that spider that's walking on the screen. And so in that moment, we may now experience tolerable stress. These are serious temporary stress responses, strong emotional reaction for fear on that, because of that spider. But if we have a friend nearby that tells us, look, it's not real, I know you're scared, begin to elicit some or exhibit empathy for why I'm scared, even though I know it's not a real spider. Remember, phobias are irrational fears, and even though we know that's not a real spider, I might still be very scared of it. And so, but having that friend, that uh, colleague, that partner that tells us, look, you're fine, I'm here with you, that buffers some of the impact of that uh, cortisol that gets injected. Um, and for some, if without that supportive relationship, as that spider continues to walk, it's a prolonged exposure to that spider, and it's this prolonged activation of the stress response system. And so I can't disengage, for example, on this spider, and now I am really, really, really scared, and not having anyone there to help rely upon. Um, Even at the conclusion of this, moving on without the spider, we're still, thinking about the spider, we're still afraid of that spider. That injection of cortisol throughout our body will remain, and then in those moments it becomes toxic stress response in our system, in which um, our body's on overdrive. And even though the scary, situation is no longer there, we're still reacting as though it is. And this is where we begin to see the potential development into trauma and the breakdown in neurophysiological systems, especially for kids who experience something like this early on in their childhood. So um, if you're able to sort of just imagine what that's like for a child, right? We all have different responses to that spider, from, um, no reaction whatsoever. We know it's just a picture on the screen that um, is crawling, to, oh my gosh, uh, this is so scary. How kids in our classrooms, students in our classrooms may have um, very much sort of similar sort of variability in their responses. And to imagine how for some of these children, especially in those who are experiencing toxic stress without the supportive relationships, may actually experience those symptoms, but may not have the words to describe it, or even know what those are. And so for some of you who are really afraid of the spider, and I move on to the next slide, um, here, for example, even though the spider is no longer there, we're still exhibiting that response. And so imagine for kids um, who are not in those homes, in those adverse events and adverse environments, coming into your classroom, exhibiting some of those symptoms as a result of the cortisol being excreted and experiencing toxic stress. How, for example, some of those kids may be experiencing uh, uh, traumatic reactions without us knowing. And so this prolonged activation and exposure may begin to result in structural and functional changes across different neurophysiological systems. So the HPA axis means that kids may be more susceptible to stress and are more reactive to what seems to us perhaps as not stressful events, but for them it is. Changes in the amygdala and their reactivity to emotions, along with the anterior cingulate cortex and the prefrontal cortex. We might begin to see changes in their reward network. And what that means is that it might manifest itself as lack of motivation, for example, in the classroom. So it's important for us to be able to understand how, for kids who've experienced adverse events that turn into trauma, that many of these physiological changes might result in the behavior or academic or social or mental health responses that we see in the classrooms. Now, uh, and let me end with this real quick before I'm going to turn to Rob and see if there are any questions or comments in the chat. As I talk about stress responses in the body, I want us to think about in particular, the children and families that we are working with. When we look at those or think back to those types of traumatic events I mentioned earlier, as I uh, mentioned to everyone, it's not exhaustive. There are things that we need to consider that might be adverse experiences for kids, especially for those who are in military families. Um, what we need to understand, for example, is that for a lot of the children, it doesn't have to be abuse. It doesn't have to be neglect. It doesn't have to be these sort of disastrous types of events. When we begin to think about the impact on military families, we want to be able to think about what happens to students in our classrooms when there's parental absence. Oftentimes, we only think about deployment as a big event that affects military children. But there are also other ways in which service member parents may be away. It's not necessarily just deployment, but temporary duty, for example, that includes training exercises, advanced training schools, or activities that may keep parents away for days, weeks, months, or sometimes even long points in times in which there's no communication in families. Think about those experiences for children who are used to their father or their mother being in the home and then suddenly removed for temporary duty. And that could be construed as an adverse event that doesn't necessarily, again, have to turn into trauma with the presence of supportive family members. Now, think about dual career parents. If both parents are in the military, and what that means if the children are used to both family members, but now both family members are either deployed or engaged in temporary duty. What that means then is that kids may be placed with grandparents or other family members. And so these families then are required to have a family care plan where kids are sent to live with relatives, have to change schools. And so what happens then in those moments when kids lose their primary caregiver? So those are some of the things to keep in mind, that when I talk about adverse events, that these don't necessarily always include abuse, neglect, or some of these extreme experiences, but to really think about some of these seemingly sort of typical experiences, especially for military families, that may actually cause some um, adverse reactions for kids, and to be able to understand why perhaps children are behaving or why they are exhibiting specific emotional reactions, or why their grades are showing what they are. And so if we are able to understand that perhaps for some of these kids, we want to then maybe keep those stress experiences into the tolerable zone as much as possible by being empathic or empathetic to their experiences, be that sort of supportive environment, supportive relationship to buffer those adverse events. So um, let me pause there and see if there are any questions or comments. Robin?
Sure. Yeah, there's been a few. So first, what can professionals do if, or what should they do when they're interacting with students and the professional feels that their own trauma might be coming up and bringing
Mhm.
intense feelings, um, s- because maybe this child is experiencing something that they themselves may have experienced. What guidance or advice do you have for professionals that are might find themselves in that circumstance?
Yes, that's a great question, because I think by the very nature of you recognizing that is already a good step. I think sometimes the challenge is when we're not even recognizing some of those elicited responses on our end. And so it is important to take that first step of recognizing the impact on us, which, if we don't address it, ends up becoming potentially a secondary traumatic stress reaction on our part as educators, as the caregiving adults. And so being able to recognize those moments it would be important. Now, if we anticipate those events or those experiences occurring, we might take preventive steps, like I'm sure you've all heard of, um, efforts to engage in self-care. And so most of these activities like meditation, yoga, um, taking a walk, um, these are important for preventive approaches. In those moments, however, when we begin to sense that this is happening because of our own experiences, as the educator, for example, in a system, a school system that's creating something that's more trauma informed, it's important to have a network of colleagues that you rely on. And so, in those instances, understanding the impact of our own emotional reaction into our pedagogical response, it's important for us to then reach out to those colleagues. So creating this team will, number one, not uh, rely on just you as a single person to address the traumatic impact on students, but to have a team of educators that you could rely on. Um, Additionally, being able to have access to professional supports, mental health support in particular, would be important to be able to work through some of those reactions that we may have had from our past so that we are not uh, projecting that onto the student that has it.
Great, thank you. Another one that came in is how do we look differently or similarly at trauma versus social emotional behavior? For instance, a child repeatedly comes to school seemingly agitated. What questions should we ask ourselves to try to understand what might be going on there?
Excellent question. And actually, I will answer that in a little bit too, in a more sort of formal way. But the short answer to that is, I think, and this is one of the challenges is where does our sort of fact-finding approach differ from really understanding what the student's bringing in and teaching to what they're bringing in with them? What that means is, with so much push for trying to identify trauma and adversity in schools, we might find ourselves trying to explain away some of those behaviors by saying, well, tell me a little bit more, or trying to figure out what kind of trauma happened in this child's history that may be resulting in this. And I think if we begin to go down that direction of fact finding, we then are not seeing the messaging that the behavior is sort of conveying. And so it really is important to understand what is it that the child is bringing into the classroom, and how can we understand some of those challenges that may uh, um, interfere with the child's learning, rather than trying to understand what is the cause. Sometimes understanding what the cause is may be helpful to understand what type of strategies might be available. Um, and so, as long as it's tied into really understanding what is being presented so that we can understand the type of effective strategies, pedagogical responses to help them learn, I think that's something that we need to be aware of.
Great. Um, Someone asked in the chat about what can be said about secondary stress or trauma that's caused by a soldier who has PTSD. So I'm assuming that the question is meaning if if one of the parents perhaps or caregivers has PTSD, what can be said kind of about the secondary stress or trauma that might cause to the family, including the children.
Yes. That's definitely an important consideration, especially when we're thinking about military families returning from active duty. A lot of it really is, understanding, even if it is secondary trauma, it is very real for those who are experiencing it. And that is why oftentimes those trauma symptoms develop. And so understanding its impact on the children and the family system is important. And so it would be similar to how you would then approach a child who may be exhibiting um, PTSD themselves from some of those events that I've shown earlier. A student, for example, that might be exhibiting PTSD symptoms given, let's say, violence in the community that they've experienced. A lot of it really is understanding how are some of these uh, experiences uh, potentially increasing the risk of toxic stress responses on the children's neurophysiology, and what can we do as educators to provide that caring, understanding, and empathetic response in the classroom, uh, acknowledging full well that we are not necessarily the therapist for the children in the classroom. And so this is where it's important to have that team approach where we are then engaged with the school counselor, with the school psychologist, or um, um, other resources in the community that might be helpful, which I understand also to some degree may become a challenge as well when we're thinking about um, and we'll talk about this later too, when we're talking about referrals, how such outreach might actually be challenging because for military families, what occurs as a diagnostic impression given on children may also impact mom and dad. And so there's a little bit of a nuance to that, but I think it is really being able to understand that for kids who may be exhibiting secondary traumatic stress, it's very much real for them as though they are primary. And so it's about, going back to the previous slide, what can we do to provide that supportive relationship to buffer some of that toxic stress?
Yeah. And I'm not sure if this next question kind of qualifies these examples kind of qualify as a secondary
Hmm.
stress or not, but I'm just going to kind of put it out there and see if you what your thoughts are. But someone asked about what about when a child has to take on responsibilities of caretaking, say for their siblings or even for an injured or disabled caregiver due to, you know, their military connected lifestyle and the impacts that that has. Would that be qualified as secondary stress, or what would your guidance for that?
Yeah, I think again, this is where it's hard to really have a general sort of statement because, as I mentioned earlier, there's going to be individual responses from children. The other thing to consider as well is the age of the child. If especially we're thinking about this occurring with children who are, under the age of 5, then that's definitely a concern. Um, that may, cross the line towards neglect, for example, and the parentification. But if we're talking about children who are, let's say, 17, it's very much different when we're thinking about developmental stages of kids and where they are. And even for a 17-year-old, for example, um, even though that again the individual variability in response is important to take into account for a 17-year-old, for example, who finds that to be really stressful because then it's impeding on their developmental milestones, then that could be potentially but again, this is where it becomes very depending on the child, and this is where it's really important to understand and get to know our students to be able to understand its impact on them.
Okay. We have just two more for this period, and then we'll kind of move forward, and there'll be other chances at the end, so if people can continue to drop them in the chat. But one individual brought up the question around, what if the job they hold themselves, right, is the
Mhm.
trauma cause? Like, for example, if they're a CPS investigator, what are best practices to mitigate those impacts other than those that you mentioned? Kind of specifically, do you know of any trainings or team guided internal actions that can be recommended to help staff and leadership support a healthy workforce in those very challenging fields such as, CPS and investigation?
Yes. I wish I had a definite answer. Let's talk and let's create one.
Right,
Um,
right.
no, but one of the things that I've been trying to work on with my colleague and a school partner that we have in the community is precisely the notion that for a lot of the teachers in this case, it's not CPS. Um, but for a lot of the teachers who are dealing with high prevalence of traumatic events in that community, teachers themselves are also experiencing not just secondary traumatic stress from the students, but also their own primary stress from the community violent events that are occurring. And so one of the things that we did talk about in terms of understanding the school need is to create the for them, we called it a professional learning community. It's really this, as I mentioned earlier, it's this team approach because especially when we're thinking about CPS workers, you are in a day-to-day as a former family therapist working with kids in foster care, and kids who were actually primarily removed from their homes. The stories that you hear are quite um, it, it'll have an impact on you. And so having the team approach and having I think regular debriefings would be helpful. Having those check-in moments for one another. I think the original question was really great about, when you're beginning to recognize the impact on your own trauma. And so in those cases, I think the question had to deal with one's own prior traumatic history. In this case, the question is, how is the current experience with the children that I'm working with affecting me and beginning to surface as traumatic stress? Having some of those sort of, and this is where perhaps the team guided internal actions would be helpful to develop, um, creating protocols and standard operating procedures in which you have daily check-ins with one another, emotional check-ins to see where you are with your own stress level. Then what are actionable steps that one can take? Can you reach out to a colleague to begin to then hand over the case and sort of tag team? So there are those things that you can begin to maybe create into an SOP for some of those agencies.
That's helpful. And then lastly, before we move forward, can a child's diagnosis with autism or ADHD be the source of stress or trauma?
Um, I guess one of two things. If I'm understanding the question correctly, would this be a source of trauma for the child? Um, Another way to interpret that question is, could this be a source of trauma for the child's siblings or family members, or peers in the classroom? Um, Again, I think anything that's a deviation from what we expect to see elicits a stress response. And, just because it is considered to be potentially a stress response reaction doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. Oh, thank you. Yes. So source of trauma for the child themselves. Um, if the child in particular, someone with autism who may have challenges with interpreting social cues, for example, and not understanding why there's a lot of conflict in the classroom, then potentially yes. And a lot of it is not necessarily trauma, but stress responses for sure. And this is where I think it's helpful for us to understand, perhaps for those children, what are their goals? If they're not meeting those goals, what's um, the stress response that we can then begin to come in and help buffer by offering some supports. Again, in these scenarios, it really is about having those supportive relationships that could buffer those stress responses. And as I mentioned, with adverse events that may result in stress response in our HPA axis, as you see here, it's not necessarily always a bad thing, right? It prepares us to act. And so it becomes potentially traumatic without those supportive environments. It potentially becomes um, it would potentially become the the reaction or the strategy that might become challenging in the classroom. So it's helpful to then begin to understand how they can then engage in useful or helpful strategies to address their goals. And so what I'm not saying in this case that autism or ADHD or any kind of diagnosis is necessarily the cause. It's really about um, how, for example, some of these become barriers to what children want to accomplish, making friends, understanding the materials, right? So the stress, um, it doesn't have to be a diagnosis, but any kind of event that might prevent someone from reaching their goals becomes stressful. All right. So thank you so much for these conversations. These are really helpful. Um, and I actually, there will be another moment for us to have a conversation, but I do want to sort of, just as a reminder, as we begin to understand the impact of stress and traumatic stress, um, as I mentioned earlier with the HPA axis and the stress hormones, what we can then begin to see is that um, and we've heard this, right? The trauma brain, for example. And what that means really is that the flooding of cortisol in a child's brain, especially in those sensitive periods of development, may actually shift some of the ways in which synapses form. And so what we begin to see is that for a lot of these kids that may be exhibiting some of these stress responses, again, regardless of the cause, regardless of the antecedent, is that for a lot of these kids, it's the development of some of these strategies that occurred during some of these adverse moments. And so when we begin to think about the stress response system, again, the reason why I like the idea of just thinking about it as adversity rather than trauma immediately is that we need to understand that some of these strategies that children have developed, perhaps developed in the context of these adverse events that allowed them to adapt and to succeed and to live. And so when we think about the experiences of child abuse, for example, some of the impact on children's brains may have developed as a result of adaptation to a violent experience in which children then need to develop effective strategies that would keep them safe. And when I say effective strategies that would keep them safe, some of these might be more externalizing behaviors that we would um, sort of think about in response to perceived conflict. We might see kids, for example, develop attentional bias in which the the home in which they are growing up in that has a lot of abusive tendencies may cause them to then pay attention more carefully, right? And so a lot of this you'll see, for example, in how their parietal lobes and the frontal lobes are wired so that they are attuning to what may be perceived as a threat to be able to anticipate how to respond to protect themselves. And so in those environments, these are necessary adaptations for children to survive. Now, it's context dependent. And so what we then begin to see in the classroom in which there may not be some of those adverse events, um, children's brains are wired to then pay attention to threat more carefully, or that they may have a more reactive response. And so for a lot of these kids, um, it's those behaviors that are important in one context to keep them safe, but not in another. And so a lot of the challenges that then we begin to see in the classroom really are adaptive in one environment, and they are perhaps having a more challenging time recalibrating, so to speak, and then understanding that in the classroom, they have to engage in different strategies. And so it's really important to be able to acknowledge that for kids that may have had prior adverse and traumatic experiences. And so when you see kids, for example, that may appear to be inattentive in the classroom, may be staring at something that we don't perceive necessarily as threatening, but they do. And so they are focusing on that. We might see, for example, kids who begin to anticipate that we are being mean to them as teachers when in fact we're not. And so there's this sort of attributional bias of hostile intent. What that means is even if we come at them in a neutral manner, they may assume that we are mad. We might begin to see more reactive responses instead of what we would typically expect from kids to stop and wait. Changes in the frontal lobes, for example, and the amygdala and the hippocampus. Here, as you see, may cause kids to engage in a more sort of reactive emotional response to protect themselves. And so it's really about shifting our perception and interpretation of kids' behaviors as they come into the classroom. And so what that means then is that we need to understand that when some of these experiences of adversity and trauma occur early in childhood, that if some of those neural mechanisms and connections are impacted, that it's not necessarily the end of the world. It means that we need to understand that despite some of those adverse events, as I mentioned earlier, right, with tolerable stress, we need those supportive relationships to help children regain back some of the more effective strategies in different contexts. And so what this means is that learning processes can improve over time that allows kids to be able to learn across different domains. They become more adaptive as they get older. Um, but as learning processes develop, so does the brain, and vice versa. What this means, though, for us, especially that's working with older students, is that as we age, this level of malleability of the brain gradually decreases. And so what you see here, for example, is that this orange line represents the effort it takes to learn something new. And the blue line represents the brain's ability to actually take this information from the environment and shift and connect and make these changes as needed. And so as you see here, our brains are more wired to changes early on in childhood. And again, this is why early childhood is an important sensitive period of development to think about. As kids get older, however, it doesn't necessarily mean that they cannot learn new things. It just means that, as we get older, we need to understand that the effort that we need to put into place to change some of those strategies that are already embedded may take a little bit more time, a little bit more patience, a little bit more effort. One example I often talk about is, if you are right-handed and you've, learned how to write using your right hand, and then suddenly you'll have to learn how to write with your left, right? The amount of effort and attention it takes to then learn how to write as well with your left hand if you are right-handed, or vice versa, is going to be very, very effortful. It's going to take time, a lot of patience with ourselves. It's not always going to look perfect the first time. And so what then this means for kids is that if we begin to see some of those strategies that were effective for adaptation in an adverse event, but not effective for learning in the classroom, that to shift those strategies to be more effective for learning will take time as kids are older. And so it doesn't necessarily switch overnight. And so being able to acknowledge that is going to be helpful. Um, this notion of equifinality and multifinality is something that I did want to bring up because, as I mentioned previously, when you think about the developmental trajectories of children, we can begin to think about their growth and development and learning in these two concepts, equifinality and multifinality. So what this means, for example, with equifinality, where multiple paths can lead to the same developmental outcome, one way to begin to think about this is once, I think someone asked a question right earlier about what if a child has ADHD? Um, and so one of the things that we can then begin to think about is perhaps that child who's exhibiting ADHD symptoms or may seem to be inattentive is one final path in which all students then begin to get placed in, or someone, for example, that a child that requires special education services that have, let's say, that one diagnostic label. Uh, Even though they all end up in that one diagnostic label, there may have been multiple sources um, or multiple starting points in which those kids end up showing similar types of symptoms. So, as I mentioned earlier, someone that may have experienced adverse events over time and in their early childhood um, development may show some of those sort of attentional bias to threat. And so that's one sort of starting point that shows later on as ADHD. Someone may actually have uh, sort of biologically as part of their makeup without having experienced adversity at all may uh, display some sort of inattentiveness that may get diagnosed as ADHD. Someone with a temperamental disposition that is more reactive, that shows later on as ADHD, again, is a normal natural development, but could be diagnosed as ADHD. In these instances, we can then begin to see an equifinality. And one of the things that is important to keep in mind is that for some of those kids, the intervention efforts may not work for some because of whatever happened in the beginning. Multifinality, on the other hand, is this notion that everyone may have started out with the same experience, but end up being in different endpoints. And so this is particularly important when we are thinking about children who have experienced adverse events, in that they are not going to necessarily be doomed to failure. This is where it's important to understand that kids who have experienced adversity can rely on some of the individuals, like all of you, for example, to provide that supportive relationship to mitigate the impact of toxic stress and begin to actually shift. If the studies have shown that kids who have experienced adversity will show poor academic outcomes, what can we then do to shift some of those trajectories so that kids will have the support that they need? And so this is important because our role as caregivers and educators become that much more important as we are shifting trajectories for kids who've experienced adversities. This notion of experience-dependent development is where you can come in, because the experience-dependent development is something that occurs constantly over the lifetime, as opposed to one that is experience expectant. This is where a lot of the experiences that occur early on in childhood during sensitive periods of development can set the stage by which children approach school and their learning. Nothing we can do about the past. The past is the past unless we've sort of invented a time machine. But this allows us to understand what kids may be coming in with, so that as the educator, we can then bring in a higher quality of caregiving and teaching, to then improve on the experience-dependent development for kids. And so as educators in early childhood and K through 12, this is where we can then begin to improve some of our pedagogical approaches to provide the support necessary for kids to thrive, despite some of the adverse experiences. So before we move on to the next section, let's see what questions you might have, or what importantly, what aha moments may have been elicited during the previous section for each of you. If you don't mind just writing this down in a drop-down menu and making those comments in the chat, that would be great.
Why don't we go ahead and I know you have a bunch of slides to move to that you want,
Yes.
and information you want to share with us, and so I'll keep track of what drops in the chat, and then
Okay.
towards the end we can revisit it. That's for sure. I like that people are putting in their aha moments, so that's really great.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Robin, for keeping that in mind. So moving on to the next section, which is hopefully the sort of exciting sort of section in which we then begin to ask ourselves, what can we do? How can we provide or promote learning, and how do we provide that instruction in the context of adversity? And so this is where we begin to move towards trauma-informed practice. And to start us off, let's take a look at the definition of learning, which entails the acquisition if we are learning something new, or modification if we are trying to shift our understanding of something, of knowledge, beliefs, attitudes, strategies, emotions, and behaviors that often result And what's key here is this result in enduring changes. So it's not just, one moment and then we forget it the next. It's really something that we take with us for a long time because of these different experiences, which then leads to variability in how we develop and grow and learn over time. Um, so, one of the reasons why learning is important for us to understand in relation to trauma and adversity is that when we think about trauma and adversity's impact of the brain, most of the time we might see this manifest in self-regulation, which is the primarily volitional management of our attention and arousal, which includes our stress physiology and emotional arousal for the purpose of goal-directed action. Right. And this is why I was talking earlier about the importance of understanding the goals of our children or of our students to understand then what strategies are they using to self-regulate. And so when we think about self-regulation, it really is this sort of bi-directional process of bottom up when we think about automatic responses to the environment, such as emotional reactivity, our physiological responses. These are automatic. Something happens, we look. The top-down processes are more of these active, engaged processes that allow us to be more effortful. It's more cognitive control, our purposeful attention and inhibition. And so when we think about the impact of adversity on the prefrontal cortex of the brain, for example, this is really what is impacted is this sort of top-down processes in which we can inhibit a reactive response so that we can then refocus towards our goal. So think about in the classroom, you're giving, you're talking to the students, a loud noise happens, everyone orients, and that's normal. It's really about knowing that, okay, that was just a distraction. Let me go back, let me look and pay attention back to what the teacher is saying. So it's that reorientation that is important. And so sometimes these processes can be imbalanced, which then affect how we interact with our environment, with others, and how we then achieve our goal and understand how far we are from our goal. Self-regulated learning, on the other hand, is an iterative process. So this is more related, it's more cognitive, and it's related to how we are engaging with, sorry, um, how we are engaging in our more effortful control to adapt towards the learning process in service of a goal. So here we see three interrelated processes: the forethought and planning, which is the stage in which we begin to look at the task we're going to approach. If you are, let's say, um, a student who has to do your homework assignment, you need to understand how hard is it, how hard is the, let's say, reading assignment, how hard is the reading assignment, what's my own level of expertise in reading, can I do this, is it important? And so all of these sort of preparations that go into the task comes into play. From there, we go into the performance and monitoring phase where the kids themselves are then engaging in the task. So kids then who might be doing the homework of reading may then begin to look at, okay, I have one particular strategy to read. I'm going to read once throughout. Is that helpful? Is that effective? So there's a lot of sort of self-observation and monitoring of the task, the strategy. Is it helpful? Is it not? If it's not helpful, do I need to break down the words if I'm coming across with big words into phonetic um, chunks so that I can then engage in a better way of understanding how to say the words and understand it? Is this too hard? Do I go back to my forethought and planning and say, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't read this advanced physics textbook if I really want to read something that is more story oriented. And so there's a lot of back and forth. When the task is done, a learner then goes to reaction and reflection, right? In this case, you then say, okay, I did well. Is that because of luck? Is it because I put the effort in? In this phase, it's really important that we begin to see children and students and teachers actually promote a growth mindset in which most of the reflection on our performance is about the effort that we put in. How can we grow from this? And so what we begin to see, especially for those who are children who are exposed to adversity, is that some of these processes are negatively impacted. And it's important because then it allows us to think about where can we come in. Do we come in at the reaction and reflection phase to promote a growth mindset? Do we come in at the forethought and planning phase to be able to help children understand their own prior knowledge, their own resources that they can go into the learning task with? Can we help them with motivation? I think oftentimes we focus primarily on the performance and monitoring by looking at self-control or inhibitory control or being able to use strategies. And it's really important to understand that these three are necessary for students to succeed. And so it's important for us to understand those in the context of learning. And one of the one of the concepts of adversity that I like instead of trauma is to then make space for resilience. Because oftentimes when we think about adversity or trauma itself, it seems so deterministic. And so by making space for resilience and thinking about adversity, especially if we think about some of the strengths or adaptations that might be potential strengths, we can then begin to leverage children's strengths within a supportive environment in which we can understand, okay, what is it that they've adapted in response to adversity that can be useful in the classroom? And what can we do as the teachers and educators to support caregivers and other service supports to actually promote academic success, fostering the resilience through some of those strengths? So doing this, we need to be able to, as I mentioned earlier, understand and acknowledge the individualized response to trauma and adversity, that not all kids are going to exhibit the same responses. We need to understand that some of the downstream consequences of adversity may result in different harmful as well as adaptive effects. And so understanding the differences, especially in the context in which it may be helpful for survival, but not in learning. We also have to acknowledge the unique strengths and abilities that each kids may have, so that we can move away from this deficit approach so that we can support kids who've experienced trauma. So it's not just this, you've experienced trauma, and this is one of the reasons why I said let's move away from just fact finding, right? Particularly when we begin to use the ACEs or Adverse Childhood Events measure, which is now being sort of pushed across schools. Instead of looking at some of these events that may elicit a deficit approach, let's look at what is a positive that we can leverage our teaching on. And more importantly, when we think about resilience, it's not just the teacher's own resilience. It's not just the student's own resilience, right? It's multiple connected systems that require the learning environments to understand adversity and to be able to, as a team, as a system, provide those supportive relationships. And so not only is that important to help the students thrive, but again, as mentioned earlier in the question, prevent burnout and secondary traumatic stress on the educators who are working with the children. And so hopefully by moving away from this deficit approach and solely identifying traumatized students, as I mentioned earlier, especially with those using the adverse childhood um, um, survey. And as a quick aside, the ACEs survey, which is really helpful and important, was originally developed uh, as a way to understand the prevalence of adversity, but it was a study done with HMO participants in California, primarily adults, and was really developed as a way to understand population level prevalence. And it doesn't really help us understand the individualized impact on students. And so while it is important to understand the broader population effect, we need to be able to really, again, understand the impact on children, the individual approach that we are being able to then see as kids come into the classroom. By moving away from the deficit approach, we also have to be mindful about unintended effects of our negative attitudes towards students with trauma history. So we might think, for example, even though we may intend well and say, look, they've experienced trauma, I need to then maybe set my standards lower, that actually has a negative effect on children instead of saying, here is the individual child's ability. This is the This is what they can accomplish. Let's hold them to that standard and offer the supports to help them succeed. Uh, and moving away from the deficit approach also allows us to incorporate a whole child perspective, which also not only incorporates the individual child's strengths, but also bring in the family and the community. Because as I mentioned earlier with the bioecological framework, what you'll see is that we are interconnected. And so having the community is really important to acknowledge as well. And so hopefully what we can do, because, as we were talking about this in terms of students with adverse experiences, it's not just one-on-one, even though for that student, it's a relationship with you as an educator, as a caregiver, as someone that provides the helpful and needed support. But these are all approaches that we can use to build a supportive classroom as a universal practice that would hopefully benefit all students. And so this is something that would be not just important to consider for kids who have experienced adversity, but for everyone else in the classroom. So it's important to then understand and acknowledge our role as teachers in this endeavor as educators. I talked about the student having their own self-regulated learning process. As educators, as caregivers, we also have our own SRL and self-regulation process. And what happens here in the classroom or in the home is that there may be goal incongruence where a teacher may want to teach multiplication, but then a child who doesn't feel safe wants to maintain that emotional security. So what might occur in a classroom when the goals of the students and adult don't align, feel free to please put this in the chat. But one of the things that I've noticed with those misalignment is this is where the conflict occurs. We then begin to see some of the strategies that the child used to maintain safety in the home applied in the classroom, and not understanding that that's the goal of the child leads to some of the more difficult and challenging interactions in the classroom. Of course, when we have students and teachers that have goals that align, teachers are ready to teach, students are ready to learn, then it goes for a smoother transaction. But this is where it's important for us to be aware of our own process through this as well as the students. And so we can then begin to think about this as really a co-regulation or co-regulatory process in which how we regulate ourselves is related to how students may regulate themselves. And this is where it's important for us as educators to think about an adaptive approach into which we begin to teach in response to our students' needs. So we need to be able to learn how to regulate our own approach in the classroom, our pedagogical approach, our own teaching practice, regulate our own emotional reactions and well-being, and then engage students in promoting their own self-regulated learning process from the motivation to the to the performance phase to then the self-reflection. And so to be able to have students engage in those SRL processes or self-regulated learning processes, we as teachers have to engage in self-regulated teaching so that we can promote some of those practices as well. Essentially, what we're trying to get at here is a unified goal in which we understand the children's and the students' needs that they're coming up with. If their goal is to maintain emotional security because of adversity, if there are ways that we can address that goal and then get to the same goal of engaging in an academic goal, this is them becoming a more dynamic and dyadic process. All right. So in the interest of time, if you don't mind, I'm going to push through, but if you can, provide or share one way you may use what you've learned in your day-to-day work with children and youth. And again, just to let you know, from what Robin posted earlier, there is a link that allows you to download the presentation. So you're able to kind of go back again, so you don't have to take copious and quick notes. All right. So this is in the last section about connecting with other resources. It's important for us to understand the need for prevention as we are thinking about adversity and its impact on development and learning. We've talked about what you can do to intervene in a classroom. What can we do, therefore, to prevent some of these from happening? And so it's really important for us to acknowledge that for a lot of children, especially given the importance of sensitive periods of development in infancy and toddlerhood, that we provide access to early intervention and quality early education experiences to prevent further developmental delays and disabilities, especially for kids who've experienced adversity. By intervening early and providing kids and families with access to services, we can then begin to see positive, or hopefully see positive development in the cognitive, social, emotional, and academic domains. And so what this means is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, with the system approach, it's important for us to be able to actually involve as many service providers as possible to offer some of these supports. This includes the involvement of early childhood special education. Oops, sorry. And when we begin to think about early intervention in education, especially for kids who've experienced maltreatment or have been involved with child welfare, it's important to understand that CAPTA provides federal funding to states so that they can support prevention, assessment, investigation, and treatment for maltreatment. It also requires states to develop provisions and procedures in conjunction with the IDEA Part C to provide early intervention and early education. And what you see and what we know, for example, is there are some states who are already doing this. So one example is EI eligibility criteria in Illinois is something that is being provided already, especially in Chapter 9, Section 1.3, which I think is part of the resources that you'll receive. And so there are states that are doing this already. Massachusetts is another example in which they are actually providing some of those referrals for kids and families who have been involved with child welfare. However, even though these efforts are being put in place, it's not perfect. We see, for example, that even though for kids who have been referred for evaluation, there are fewer kids who actually gain access to some of those necessary support services. So even though we're seeing some of these great efforts being put in place, there's still room for growth. And so I'm hoping that this is something that we can begin to push forward and understand. Oh, sorry, there is the link for IDHS eligibility. And so it is important for us to begin to provide those referrals to early intervention, early Head Start, home visiting programs, early educational and developmental intervention services, Safe Babies programs. And so these are helpful for prevention efforts to ensure that even for kids who've experienced adversity early in life, that there are ways that we can then begin to prevent some of those downstream consequences that we've talked about earlier. And finally, I think it is important for us to be able to understand how to then provide those accurate referrals for evaluation and identification, especially those who are in need of special education services, as we begin to understand the impact of some of these developmental processes or developmental consequences of adversity on children's learning. One way to actually begin to really understand what kids might need is to look at early identification of language. And so being able to understand some of these domain-specific impact of adversity is important. Because for language, for example, this is a gateway to children's learning through reading, understanding, even when we think about STEM-related subjects, that language is really important for kids to understand when we're thinking about concept development. Language is the way in which we begin to transmit some of the understanding of the world. And so being able to understand, for kids who've experienced adversity, wherein language may not be as a rich environment that they were exposed to, could then be one way that we can then begin to see this. So I will end it with any additional questions. Robin, I'll hand it off to you.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and while if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. You can also, in a moment, we'll switch to a slide where you'll have contact information for Dr. Ponlilio, and you can email him at that address. I also would say, while you were speaking, Dr. Ponlilio, there were lots of comments about what people are walking away with today. You might want to take a chance to skim through those because you probably missed them as you were talking, but there were some really great comments there. Um, so I think we can go ahead and move it forward, Kathleen, or whoever's running slides. I'm not sure. Here is Dr. Ponlilio's contact information. And then join us on June 18th for the next webinar in our Uniquely Wired series. This webinar will explore ways to support families when a child does not qualify for special education services and provide guidance on navigating situations where caregivers may be hesitant about evaluations. You can check the webinar event page for information on CE credits for that webinar that is on June 18th. And I will put a link to that June 18th one right there in the chat for you. And at this point is when we will talk about continuing education. So today's webinar offers several different types of CE credits and a certificate of attendance for general use. To receive either of the items, everyone will participate in a two-step process that includes an evaluation and a follow-up survey of some kind, depending on the type of CE you want. First, you'll complete the evaluation. After that, you'll see, and I'll give you the link to that in just a second. And after that, you'll see a message that pops up and it asks you what type of CE do you want, or if you want a certificate of attendance, and then you just select the proper link for the type of CE. You'll be directed to another survey where you'll be asked to put your email and then complete a few other things. And then that certificate will be sent automatically to your email within about 24 to 48 hours. Some providers might send that certificate to the spam folder or the junk folder, so please check there if you don't see it. And if it's not there in a day or so, feel free to email us using that email that you see on the screen, ce@oneop.org. If you can't get to the survey because maybe it shows a message, an error, please take a chance to read that because a lot of times that is on a user end blocked by your firewalls, and that's not really something that we can help with, but your organization's IT department could probably help you with that. If you still get that error message, then take a screenshot and email us at that address on the screen for us to be able to help you. At this point, I will tell you that I will put the link in the chat for the evaluation, but for those watching it on the recording, if you go back to the webinar event page, you will see a purple button under continuing education credit that says continuing education. And if you click on that, you'll be directed to the evaluation survey that will take you on to what you need. Again, if you have questions or something goes sideways, you can email us at the address I just put in the chat there. Let's see. Okay, you may need to copy and paste the link that I put in the chat in order to, and put it in a browser window. And if you have pop-ups disabled on your browser window and you click it from the event page, it may not take you there. So you would need to figure out how to turn your pop-off windows off. Okay, so be sure to visit us at our website, oneop.org, to explore upcoming events, articles, resources, and more. And you can find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We'll stick around for a couple more minutes for those of you who might need to grab some links or information from the chat. But we want to thank Dr. Panlilio for being here today and for all that was shared. And thank you all for attending and for your really robust participation in the chat conversation. We definitely makes for a much more enriching experience that when that occurs. So we look forward to seeing you next time and have a great day.
I'd like to echo that thank you to everyone.